Good evening and welcome. I'm Holly Bodger, the author of a YA novel called 5 to 1, and I'm delighted to be moderating this evening's program from Not So Freezing Ottawa, Canada. First, it is important to acknowledge that the land where most of us are gathering this evening is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Today's event is part of the Ottawa Public Library's ongoing series of celebrations for International Women's Day. We are delighted to be partnering with the Ottawa International Writers Festival on our third author event this month to feature remarkable female writers. Also this year, in honor of International Women's Day, the library is highlighting the outstanding achievements of several amazing women who have emerged during this pandemic as sheroes. Please visit the OPL website for details about the library's Sheroes panel happening on March 24th, also in the spirit of International Women's Day. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Jasmine Kaur, who will discuss her recent book, If I Tell You the Truth. I'll show it up so you can see how beautiful it is. Her writing explores themes of feminism, womanhood, social justice, and love. If I Tell You the Truth is available at the Ottawa Public Library in both books and audiobooks formats. I hope the conversation this evening will inspire us as we all strive to better ourselves through healing and reclaiming identity. It is now my pleasure to welcome our special guest, Jasmine Kaur. Hi, Jasmine.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
It's great to have you all the way from warm Abbotsford, you said? I'm sure it's much nicer than it is here.
Slightly warm. I wouldn't call it warm, maybe like slightly lukewarm.
We still have snow, so it's going, but not quite nice. So it's great to have you. I'm very excited to talk about your book, which I finished reading last night, and I listened to as well. So we're going to get right into some questions I have for you. So let's start with, why don't you tell us what inspired you to tell this amazing story about Karen and Sahara?
Yeah, so growing up, I was an avid reader. I would walk into doors and walls sometimes with a book in my hand because I was not paying attention to my surroundings. But I never really got to read a book that looked and sounded like me. I never encountered stories written by people who look like me or girls who, lived in BC and Canada, South Asian girls specifically, Punjabi girls specifically. So I knew that I had stories in me. It took me time to be able to cultivate all those stories into this novel that often to me feels like an amalgamation of so many different experiences. I don't think it's a one topic book. I don't think it's a one theme novel. To me, this book is a gathering together of all the experiences that I've had and so many experiences of the women in my life who are so important to me. And it all comes together in this kind of like symphony of complexity when it, when we're exploring issues of immigration, issues of women's family relationships, gender-based violence, systemic violence when it comes to politicians. It's all of it at once because to me, our lives aren't, one topic or one theme. We are all of it at once and we're navigating and balancing so many different things. So that to me is why this book feels like it's almost like hard to quantify and like define and whittle down to like a single thing sometimes.
Okay, thanks. And can you talk about the kind of research you had to do to write this book? It's obviously set in two different places and over a 20-year period, I think. So what kind of things did you find you had to research to write it?
Yeah, so this is a contemporary novel. Like right now I'm working on a fantasy novel and that involves a lot of like world building. But for this book, I really was doing a lot of world building, even though it is very much realism. I wrote the story about a Punjabi Sikh woman who immigrates from Punjab to Canada and deals with the immigration system here. So a lot of my research centered around the experiences of Punjabi international students specifically, girls who like came from Punjab and migrated to Canada for school. I had to do a lot of research with immigration lawyers. So much of the story hinges around immigration law and issues related to migration and visas and legal status. So getting those details right was so challenging, especially when laws are constantly changing, when the immigration system is constantly changing, when things are often in flux. I also researched the Canadian Border Services of Canada, who we see in the story interrogating Gideon about her legal status here. I did a lot of research on what it would be like for Gideon were she to be detained and arrested. And my research, like it's interesting because I started with research and I ended with research as well, because like I said, by the end of the novel, there were like details of legal issues in Canada that had changed. In the novel, Gideon is detained at a certain detention center in Vancouver, and by the time I finished writing the third draft of the novel, that detention center had closed. So things were very much in flux through the process of writing the book, and it was challenging, but really rewarding to be able to do that research. And in the end, I was very conscientious about including all those notes that capture all those little legal nuances that you can't always capture within a plot where you have a certain direction that you want to go. But the conversation definitely continues.
Excellent. So why did you choose to set this in Surrey? Is there something about the experiences that you felt were unique that you wanted to reflect in Surrey? And do you think, this is a two-part question, do you think she would have had a different experience, for example, if you didn't set it in Surrey?
I think it goes back to representation. I think that Punjabi youth specifically from Surrey and from other parts of Canada tend to be, when we are seen in the media, we are stigmatized. There's only one story about us that grabs headlines, and there's a narrative I feel that exists within white Canada about South Asian youth. So I wanted to reclaim that narrative. I wanted to challenge this idea that Sikh and Punjabi youth get to be defined by tiny little boxes that are pre-set and pre-made for us. And to be able to just render a story and bring it to life in the area that I grew up in was really cool for me. I think that it's exciting for readers, especially South Asian readers who I've connected with, who get to recognize the places that we're exploring. And it also felt intuitive to me. I think that setting it somewhere like Brampton, while that would have, while I think the story could have had a similar trajectory, it wouldn't have felt as intuitive to me as setting it where I feel comfortable and where I know the terrain.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Your novel includes both prose and poetry. How did you decide which to use when you were going back and forth?
So my intention with the poetry melded into the novel was to create a mixed media experience. I think that this is a really emotional story. It's a story that pushes you sometimes to like dig deep and feel all of your feelings. And as a poet, as someone who has been, doing performance poetry for nearly a decade now, I know firsthand the power inherent in poetry to convey an emotion in a really succinct and poignant way. But I also know that when you're dealing with a challenging emotion and you get to read it in the form of a poem, if that emotion is really challenging, you aren't really forced to dwell in it for longer than you need to. So for example, there are poems in this book that deal with issues of violence, and sometimes like gender-based violence, sometimes sexual violence. And in writing those poems specifically as poems, it was my intention to lead my reader to what they need to know without forcing them to sit through pages and pages and pages of a space that might be really difficult. So I think that it's supposed to be that journey. So I think that my intention as a writer is to lead my readers to what they know, but not to like force them to dwell in spaces that are not healthy for them. And that's why I think poetry felt right for this book.
Great, thank you. Can you tell me what you think about Gideon's story is unique to someone coming from Punjab?
That's an interesting question, because I think that sexual violence is it's not unique to any place in the world. I think that we're not even like living in a day and age. It's just been like the reality for women everywhere all the time since as far as back as we can remember. Sometimes I feel like there has been this appetite for stories about women of color from places that feel far off, that deal with challenges and injustices like those that are explored in the book, because it makes people feel like that's a thing that happens over there, but that's not a problem for us. And I think when I, as I say that, I think about, the history of residential schools, for example, in Canada, the history of violence against Indigenous youth, and specifically the history of sexual violence against Indigenous youth in Canada. And it just reminds me that there is no place in this world that can scrub their hands clean of violence against girls, violence against women. I also think of Sarah Everard in the UK, whose story just came out recently, and how Sarah was assaulted and killed by a British police officer. I think about how police brutality continues to persist in the United States and in Canada. And as I think about all these things, it just reminds me that like this is everywhere all at once. And for me, the reason in setting it in Punjab was because just in the same way that I chose to set the majority of the book in Syria, I wanted to speak to what is intuitive to me and to what is intuitive to my family's history, and my own family's history with immigration. But I think that another author could have found this story in their homeland as well. And I think that another author could have found this story in Canada and the US, and elsewhere. And that's what's so startling about it. But I think that's as true as it gets.
Yeah. It's a sad coincidence, but I started reading your book just when Sarah's story came out. And I think that's what was in my head when I was thinking about the story with the police officer. Just, it was, such odd timing that horrible similarity, but yeah. So your story begins a few weeks before September 11th, which for a lot of people in North America was kind of a changing time in the attitudes towards immigrants. How did that shape Kieran's experiences in Canada? Do you feel like the time you chose was specifically because you knew that was a time where, there was just so much change in people's attitudes in a negative way, especially?
So I think I was very young in 2001. I think I was like in second grade. So my experience of that time personally may have been different if I was, 10 years old or 12 years old or 14 or in high school at the time. But what I will say is that as a Punjabi girl growing up in Canada, I've never really known a time that felt safe for me. Like I've never seen a before and after. And I don't think that for a lot of our families, there was a before where everything was okay. I think of, my parents' experiences growing up in Canada in the, 70s and 80s. I think of like bullying based on their identity, the turbans on their heads that happened long before September 11th. And it just kind of like, it didn't feel like there was a line, not just because of like when I happened to grow up, but because of like all those stories amalgamated together in my life. In terms of Gideon's story, what's interesting is Gideon comes to Canada right before September 11th takes place. But logistically, because of how the story was told and how much ground we wanted to cover over the course of 20 years, we don't actually spend, I don't think we spend like very much time at all in September of 2001 and the subsequent months. We kind of move past that through poems. So you don't see that part in the story. But without a doubt, I think that if we had explored that in the text, we would have seen that racist violence, and we would have seen that alienation that we get a glimpse of in Gideon's entry into Canada amplified even further. And I think that race and racism continues to be like an interwoven theme throughout the novel. Sahara deals with it in big and small ways at school, with classmates who are anti-immigration. And we also see, racism in the interviews about her mom, and big news network discussions about her mom's immigration story. It seems like it's a persisting theme throughout their lives, and I think that reflects my own experience of it. Like it feels never ending, and it feels like progress is slow sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Kieran refers to the consequences of her immigration papers expiring as deadly. How did the fear of being sent back to Punjab affect her life and the choices she made?
Yeah, so Gideon's story is is challenging and unique, and also like very universal in a lot of ways. Gideon, as we're introduced to her at the beginning of the story, she's leaving her home because of a specific person who has enacted violence against her, who has harmed her, who has sexually violated her. So her getting on that plane and coming to school in Canada is her way of just like staying as far as humanly possible from this particular person and everything that he represents. And you'll people will see it when they actually read the story, but like you'll see how Gideon has kind of created this cocoon for herself and this little safety network in her small little home in Surrey. And it's only when her daughter kind of like challenges her to dig and push and seek home in a new and safer way and more empowering way that she even thinks about going back home. But it takes a lot for her to get there. And I think that's true of her character. And I think that is true of, I imagine, people who have been through experiences like that, where if you are leaving harm behind, it's almost like a survival instinct. Like there's no reason almost to put things at risk and go back. And like, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but I think readers will see what happens when she's challenged on that.
Hopefully my questions don't give too many spoilers then, because I didn't avoid that. Sorry, we're going to move to Sahara on the next one. Why do you think Sahara chose a guy like Sunny for her first relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that readers will have all sorts of feelings about this, and they'll have all sorts of interpretations. For me personally, as I was thinking about the character Sunny, he's definitely a flawed person, like all of us are. He's got his own problems going on. He's complicated. He doesn't make very good decisions sometimes, but Sahara is still drawn to him. And I think you'll see a poem in the book where she's reflecting on some of those flaws and some of those challenging issues with him, and she draws a parallel with her mom, and how her mom kind of keeps her own flaws and her problems bottled up and tries to carry the weight of the world. And that was my nod to why it is that Sahara is drawn to him. I think that she sees the person that she loves most in that boy, and she also sees how she's been taught how to love. I think that she's been taught to love through a lens of sacrifice, a lens of almost like selflessness, putting yourself last, and that comes out in that first teenage relationship, which I think it tends to be true to life, that our first relationships are a reflection of all the things that we need to like work through and unpack within ourselves and learn and grow from.
I didn't put this down in my questions, but at one point you referred to him as a Surrey Jack. Is that something you made up, or is that actually an expression in Surrey?
Yeah, that's a term that I grew up around. I would call it like a derogatory term for sure. I think it describes a particular group of like Punjabi boys specifically, who embody a certain type of lifestyle, and the characters reckon with the problematic nature of that word. They reckon with the fact that all South Asian boys don't fit into a stereotype of like what has been decided for them. So it came up very conscientiously based on like the kind of conversations that I still see like in high schools in BC today.
Okay. Later on in the book, in the interview, Radhika says Kiran ran off to Canada to escape all of her problems like only a rich girl could. How does Kiran feel about that kind of criticism coming to her in the interview?
Yeah, so Gideon is, she's called out and challenged on the privilege that she had to be able to, afford to immigrate to Canada in the first place and come to school in Canada, and be at a physical distance from the person who harmed her. And you see a little bit of her feelings about that kind of processed and come to life in a later scene. But at first it's like, I imagine that she would have been surprised and shocked, but when the truth of it was when the truth of it sunk in, I think that she absorbs it in a positive way because it was true. She did have the luxury of being able to be very far away from someone who has enough political connections to harm her if she lived in his country. Um, and not everyone has that luxury. So I think that when I wrote that scene, I was thinking about the layers of oppression and privilege that exist within all of us. Like we have intersecting identities. I'm a South Asian woman. I'm a Punjabi woman. I, experience racism because of my identity, but I'm also very light skinned, and I don't experience, racism because my skin is dark. I am growing up second generation in Canada, and I have that privilege of my parents having immigrated here first. But that doesn't mean that in other capacities, I don't experience like marginalization. And I think that the more that we are able to bring to light those conversations, those parts of ourselves, and those layers, the more just society we can create for everyone. Because there are times when it's like time to speak, in my opinion, and there are times when it's time to listen. And the more listening we do, the better we are when we speak.
Kieran's mother, Hardeep, also criticizes her just around the same time in the book for not understanding that telling her story could put her own life in danger. Do you think if her mother had said that to her before the interview, Kieran would have changed her mind about coming out? I'm asking you hypothetical questions about your character, I
Yeah.
know, but do you think that's something that didn't occur to her until it happened, or do you think it would have changed how she acted if she'd known that they would threaten her mother?
I think it's a hard question because at that point, she had kind of been pulled along a little bit by her daughter to make those decisions to get closer to her mom and to be able to like speak publicly about what she had experienced. And simultaneously at that point, like, she had all those years of experience and to know exactly how dangerous this was. So to
Yeah.
me, them even coming to India and speaking their truth was a boiling point. It was like a point of desperation, that was not necessarily safe, and they both knew that it wasn't safe in some capacity. But it was their being there was a reflection of just how bad it was that they were being suffocated, and their story was being silenced. It was a boiling point that needed to happen at some point, and it happened in a very intense and challenging and dangerous way. And it might have gone differently if her daughter was less bold. But I think that it was a necessary like breaking point for Gideon for sure to be able to grow and heal from what had happened.
And do you think, like, as a character, like, I know she's a fictional person, but they feel like they're real in our heads, but do you feel like this was something that your character had to do? She had to speak publicly, like that was a line she had to cross for her own growth?
Yeah, 100%. I think that having all those years where the story of her, what had happened to her was like this burden carried in silence that she couldn't even tell her best friends and her loved ones and her daughter for all those years. For it to be able to come out in the way that it did was like very cathartic and necessary, and it was the only way for her to be in motion again. I feel like for many years of her life she was stagnant. She was unable to move forward, and unable to raise her daughter with the sense of like boldness and freedom that she would have wanted to when she was younger. And all of it happening the way that it did was that release. Um, and I've imagined a little bit about what would happen, what would happen after the story had finished. And it definitely involves Gideon being able to move forward in a liberated sense, alongside her daughter and her found family in Canada.
And you also I had, not long after that, a scene where Sahara actually speaks up for herself and when she confronts Hari. Did you have the same feeling, like, that you felt like she had to actually confront him and confront, like, her feelings about him and just everything?
For sure. I think that in the story we see her grappling with how it is that she came to be and who she is as a person, and we're kind of like processing her emotions in real time as she's making sense of who she is as a person, which is such a hard place to be in when you just don't understand who you are in relation to everyone else and yourself and your own heart. and I think that those confrontations that we see at the end of the story are exactly what they needed in those moments. Um, in the most authentic sense, I think that if my characters didn't get that closure in those moments, they may have been living with those feelings for many, many years, and it may have felt unresolved for them.
Did you find as a writer, those are often the scenes that are hardest to write because you're in the character's mind and you're confronting those people that you've kind of built up into these evil people for years and years and years. Did you find them really difficult to write, or is it like a sense of relief when you got to actually write those scenes?
Um, Very hard for sure. So I I remember like just thinking like this is it, like this is in the same way as Zahara would have been sitting there like thinking, oh my God, this is it. But I remember feeling like I needed to do right by her and, say what she would want to say if she were standing right here. And that's a hard place to write from because, these characters are fictional, but you also feel such a powerful sense of responsibility towards them, even though they're not real. They've come to life for you in very meaningful ways. And I think that in the scenes where my characters are crying, like I'm always crying as I'm writing, those emotions almost become like method acting for me and I enter them. And then the other thing is I narrated the audiobook for the novel and I was reliving all those experiences with them and approached it the exact same way in terms of like acting and method acting. So I was stepping into my characters' minds, even though they are fictional people, and trying to reflect on exactly what they would have been feeling in those extremely difficult moments. And I spent some time just like letting myself be emotional and letting myself feel all that anger, feel all that outrage, because like I said previously, this is a fictional book, but this is also the reality of the world today for so many people. Where, we see people in positions of power, men in positions of power especially, getting away with the violence that they enact upon women because of power and because of how, political systems are set up and how the world works. Um, so when I was planning to perform the book, that's what I was thinking about. I was just like really angry about everything that I had, coincidentally seen in the news that week that mirrored the story.
And I'm curious, did you ask to do the audiobook? Did they ask you? Whose idea was it for you to be the narrator?
So my publisher Harper Teen actually invited me to do the narration. And I was super nervous because I'm a spoken word artist. I perform poetry professionally in front of audiences on a mic. But narrating an entire story with multiple characters and multiple accents and tons of emotion is more like acting than it is like performance poetry. So I was terrified, but I said yes because I try to say yes to any challenge that comes to me and then rise to the opportunity. Um, and I was terrified to narrate the book because I knew exactly how emotional it was, and I wanted to do just those emotions. And in the end, I was so happy that I did, because all of that emotion that I tried so hard to capture came out on the mic in the best possible way, and the feedback has been super positive so far from listeners.
Yeah, it was great. I listened to it as well. It was great. Um, in the novel, rape is described as a selfish act. Do you think that's how Kieran interprets Harry's motivation for what he does to her?
I think that Gideon, for her own survival, tries to block out has tried to block out the thought of him in every possible way for many, many years. Um, and she internalizes like what she internalizes within herself what she thinks of him. Um, and that's a whole, experience of her trauma. But I just think that in her mind, like he is just like this black hole and just this darkness. Um, and I think that she would she would not even describe him as selfish because selfish would be kind, because of how all-consuming like his role in her life represents. Um, and her, on the flip side, like her whole perception of like what is good and what is just and what is love exists in her daughter. um and she all that that darkness, she tries to transform it into like positivity and love for her daughter. And that's how she manages to get through the day sometimes.
And so as the writer then, what, like, how did you see his motivation? Did you see it as, and in some ways in the end you say it's kind of punishment to what he thinks that she's going to do to his family. Is that how you saw him, or did you think, that's just an excuse, or how did you see his reasoning as an antagonist?
So in creating his character, I was definitely thinking about the reasons that, misogynistic people, predatory men provide themselves for the violence that they enact. And I was thinking about an interview series that I watched on YouTube, where a female journalist, went into a prison and asked a group of sexual predators and rapists why they did what they did. And I was so startled by the way in which there was like so little guilt and remorse, and um, the way that these people victimized themselves and didn't see the humanity in the women who they had violated. Um, and that's what I was drawing on for his character. I think that he is a person who has proximity to power as a police officer, and later on as a very powerful public figure. He's never experienced consequences for his actions, so he doesn't have a reference point or a framework for what consequences feel like. And he's a man. He knows that at the end of the day, he's a well-connected, powerful, wealthy man, and if he wants to do something, he can. And that makes me kind of think about, what some people in this world would do if they knew that there weren't consequences, if they knew that they could get away with things. Like, would that change the character of some of the people in our vicinity even? And I think that's where his character comes from. It's like it's quite literally this world, this society that has created a safety net and a safety system for abusive people to engage in abuse. I don't think he ever has felt remorse, and I don't think that he ever will feel remorse. I don't think that he has spent the time to learn how to feel empathy for women especially.
And what about his brother? I know we don't really ever have him on the page anywhere. Um, and I think her mom says that his brother's sided with him. But in your head, do you think his brother just said, "Yes, I believe you"? Do you think at any point that he might have sided with Kiran, or like how did you interpret his reactions? He just went along with what his family told him to.
Yeah, I think that Huddy's character, so he finds out the truth of what his brother had done quite early on, we see in the story. Um, and I think that within him, you would have seen like a tiny like seed of doubt, but ultimately loyalty to another man before a woman. And I think that's true of a lot of the cases that I've seen in my life, in a small sense, where, you'll have a guy say something really horrible to a woman, and all of his friends will just kind of like, they might not say that personally, but they're going to take their friend's side, they're going to take their brother's side, and they're not going to call him out or on it or challenge him on it or expect better from him. And that's what I was drawing on for his character. He had the opportunity very much, as a man in a position of privilege in the situation, to advocate for Kiran, and he didn't. And unfortunately, that's very true to like what I've witnessed.
And do you think that's one of the things that makes it worse, is that it's not just that the man has the power, but that he knows he also has the support of the other men around him, and that they will side with him in most instances instead of with her?
Absolutely. And I think that kind of plays into this whole system and that safety net that I was describing, where the world is really set up, in order to give men the benefit of the doubt as far as they can possibly get it, and then even pity them when the consequences come along, if they do somehow come along in any capacity. And to me, it's rooted in misogyny. It's rooted in how, women across all societies are ultimately we are ultimately like viewed as nuisances sometimes, and um, causers of harm to like the aspirations of men, and it comes out, I think, like everywhere, at every level of society, from someone who doesn't have a lot of power to someone who was the president of the United States for 4 years, to like leaders of CEOs and like other spaces where like people, where money takes precedent over what is true. um and and even as I think about it like that, it's like there's so much work that needs to be done in our world to create safer spaces for women, in all, whether you're walking down the street at night or going to work, or just navigating spaces that should be for you. The work is taking place as we speak, as we tell these stories openly and speak our truths and create space for honest conversation, but there's still so much that needs to be done.
Yeah, and I think as you just said, you were probably working on this book during the Trump reign, and it I think in many instances showed us still how much further there was to go, even if it felt like we'd come fairly far. Um, this is going to seem like a random question, but I'm really curious. Why does Kieran see Earth as female? It's something that you mentioned early on. I'm just curious. Is is there a reason? Is it because she has distanced herself from male? Is it something to do with Earth, or is it just the way you see Earth?
Yeah, part of it is just me and what I intuitively feel about things. And I think the other part of it is that when Gideon comes to Canada, she has this support network of women around her that feels exactly the opposite of everything that she's experienced in the past. And she seeks a lot of comfort and safety in women. And I was very conscientious even about giving her a home of found family filled only with women, because she needed that safe space in order to heal and feel like, she can rest easy at night after what she'd been through. Um, and intuitively, I think that that's where she she describes the earth as a woman, because to her that is what safety feels like.
Okay. Um, do you think Kieran's story would have been different if she'd landed in Canada before abortion became legal in 1988 and she didn't have that as an option, or that her mother didn't have that as an option to hold over her?
Yeah. So I'm like a very pro-choice person. I am very much about, the ability for people to make the right decisions for themselves. And what's interesting about her story is, we see a conversation with her and her friend, and they're teenagers, they're about 18 or 19 years old, and they're talking about what Gideon wants to do in this situation. And her friend, her advice is the same advice that she would have given if Gideon's decision was to not have the baby, which is that this is your body, and if you want the baby, then you should be able to have the baby, period. And I think that if Gideon's story took place in a time where that choice wasn't there, because that because ultimately like she wanted to have the baby, it wouldn't have affected her in that sense. But I think that there still would have been a pressure to have the abortion from her family's side, but it would not have been safe. I think that abortion access is so important because I think of the history of very very unsafe abortions that have taken place over past generations. Abortion has always existed, but it just hasn't been a safe medical procedure for women. And I think that would have been my worry for her, if she was dealing with this in a generation when she didn't have that autonomy or that choice to do what was right for herself.
This kind of leads into my next question, which was that some women in her choice, in her situation, would have chosen not to keep the baby. Why is it so important to her, knowing that she's giving up pretty much her family and risking her own safety and her life for this baby? Why is it so important to her that she wants to have her?
I think that as a young person, reeling from everything that she had been through, and especially knowing that when she's giving up her family, it's kind of like her family kind of gave up on her a long time ago in the way that they cared for her, in her specific family dynamic. So she's coming to a new place feeling already that she doesn't have anyone. And I think that that feeling, especially as a young person, of being completely alone would have terrified her. And her desire to have a baby came from that desperation to not be alone anymore. And it was really that simple. She just needed someone in this world who would love her. And what I think is so interesting is that motherhood and parenthood tends to be romanticized when before someone has kids, and then reality sinks in, and people realize just how hard it is to be a parent, and all the unromantic stuff and all the really difficult stuff that comes along with it. So feeling about, having a kid definitely evolves as she experiences firsthand just what a struggle it is. But in that place, before her baby was born, she knew that that was right for herself. And it was a very desperate place that she was in. And that was why she held on to the baby.
Nadini says that the shame of rape is made possible because of the valuation of a girl's virginity. What do you think would have to change in the world to prevent that kind of thought being used as a weapon?
I think there's so much work to be done. And, even in my own social media space, I try to, on Instagram, facilitate conversations around, the stigmatization of women's bodies and the bodies of people with uteruses. Because, we're living in 2021, but there is still so much misinformation about, uterine health and reproductive health and all sorts of stuff like that, and especially, issues related to women. So to me, there's no one size fits all answer, but it comes in these small spaces. It comes in those conversations that we can have with, the younger girls in our life and the older women as well, about our own rights to ourselves and the misinformation, the scientific misinformation that we need to smash, especially around like concepts of virginity.
So in the same speech, Nadini refers to a girl's reputation as the most important garment she wears. And I have to tell you, I'm a bit of a obsessed with metaphors, and it's my favorite metaphor in your whole book. I love this idea that it's both like a physical garment you might lose, and a protective one. Anyways, just saying that. What do you think do you think this is something that only applies to girls, and do you think that will ever change?
I think I think it very much applies to women, as I've seen it, and to women identified people. And I say that because, like, even in like a very literal sense, boys and men aren't typically policed on like what they step out of the house wearing. But every single decision that a woman makes about, what she puts on her body is seen as like, something up for public critique. And is seen as a reflection of her inner nature and who she is as a person. And I feel like that all of that tends to be placed on women, and I haven't seen it the other way around. So like in a literal sense, like what we wear, the honor of what we wear, is very much tied to like our external, as women. And it's interesting. It's just like infuriating for me. It's like a source of like a lot of anger that I feel all the time. And I see changes. Like I see changes all the time in, the conversations that girls and women have around me. But just like everything else, there's so much more work to be done.
Yeah. And not to use an American example, but in the last few years, we've seen a certain leader make mistake after mistake after mistake, and it did nothing to his reputation in a lot of circles. Meanwhile, someone named Monica Lewinsky is still being made fun of for something like nowhere near as bad that she did decades before that. So it's definitely a double standard in many circles. I'm curious, I'm gonna hold it up again for anyone who hasn't seen it. Cover. What's the significance of the hands on the cover? Did you suggest it or pick it, or did you have a cover designer that came up with that?
Yeah. So when I got to work with Sarah Slough, who did the cover art for the book, my editor kind of asked me, what do I envision for the cover? And I didn't give her a lot because I was curious about what Sarah would come up with, but I said that I envisioned hands, and I definitely envisioned butterflies, and butterflies are an ongoing theme in the book, and you'll see why when you read it. But I actually didn't get a chance to talk to the cover designer about why she chose the hands and to place them as she did, but I have my own interpretations, like as the author. And to me, like I see the title very much embodied in the hand. So, we see this hand kind of reaching up as if, you're ready to tell your truth, but then you see the other hand pulling it back down and kind of being more pensive and questioning and saying, like, is this really the right way to go? And I think that encapsulates that conflict that Gideon has throughout the book, thinking about whether telling her truth to the world is the right thing to do for herself and for her daughter. And it's hard. It's like there's not always a black and white answer sometimes about whether it's safe to tell your stories. And that kind of is encapsulated in all of that unsureness that you see.
It's funny because when I look at it, now that you say that, you can see the hand pulling her down, but I also looked at it as the hand lifting her up. So you can also see it as someone is helping her tell her truth. So it kind of has a dual meaning depending on how you look at it. My next question actually just came up in the chat, but I had the same question. So this comes from me and from someone in the chat. So this is your second book with these characters. For anyone on the call who hasn't read the first book or either book, can they start with the second one or should they read the first one first?
So you can definitely read If I Tell You the Truth without reading When You Ask Me Where I'm Going first. In the first book, When You Ask Me Where I'm Going, that's a poetry collection that includes a short story about Gideon and Sahara. So it's almost like a little bonus chapter that you get to see. And if you love this story, you'll want to get a further insight into who they are. So it just adds a little more nuance to things that were happening all around them as the story is progressing. So it's definitely not a prereq for this book, but it'll definitely add to your reading experience if you want to pick that up before or after.
Okay. In your mind, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, what happens next for your characters? Do they get a happily ever after? Is there more to the story?
I think that, so this is definitely like a one book story for me. But as I've imagined it, I think that Gideon and Sahara get that comfort that they've always wanted, which is knowing who they are and knowing how to deepen their love for one another as a mother and daughter, and feeling like life is safe now. Like they have Gideon has her safety in Canada, and she has a solid network of people around her who love and care about her, and that's something that she didn't get to grow up with, for all sorts of reasons. So that is their happy ending, and I also think that even as I'm saying that, like, I think that trauma isn't this thing that just gets solved one day and leads to like a beautiful forever. It's peaks and valleys, and that knowing that they're in a good place when the story ends off doesn't mean that necessarily every day is going to be beautiful and every day is going to be empowering, but they have the tools in their tool belt now emotionally, to be able to navigate those challenges with one another by their side.
So I just want to add a reminder to everybody listening that you can put your questions in the chat if you have more. We've left time for questions, but and I'm going to keep going with mine, but I will pause. If you have some, just put them in the chat. So the rest, I have some questions, and these are a little bit more about writing in general. So can you talk about what it was like realizing you were going to publish a book in the middle of a pandemic?
Yeah, so interestingly, I finished the final draft of the book just before the pandemic was officially named a pandemic. And I think back to how like just challenging it was to adjust to all sorts of new information and a new reality in those first few months of like March last year. And I'm actually like grateful that I was able to finish the novel just before then, because I don't think that I would have been able to be creative when the world felt like it was just like falling apart in a lot of ways. And also interestingly, because I wrote the novel and finished it and finalized everything just before the pandemic, we see scenes in the book that are set in 2020 and 2021, that don't necessarily reflect what it would be like, for undocumented folks and immigrants living in this year. For a while, in 2020, the CBSA, Canadian Border Services Agency, they paused deportations of undocumented immigrants for a short period of time, and then that was reinstated. In the US, there was never really a pause. It just kind of slowed down a little bit. And those, were to me reminders of the fact that systems that are unjust don't stop being unjust just because, there's compassionate reasons to be, to care for others. Simultaneously, Gideon would have, been terrified if she had gotten sick to go to the hospital and seek help, knowing that, you know, her immigration status could have come into question, despite the fact that BC hospitals now have some safeguards in place for undocumented immigrants. That fear would have been really real and all pervasive for her. So, you know, thinking about like where I was and how, you know, in March 2020, and as I was thinking about what my storytelling would have been like back at that time if I was writing then, I was seeing all this stuff happening around me in real life and was just thinking, what would this mean for my characters? And I knew that the whole novel would switch around and have to be revised if we wanted to truly capture 2020 and the pandemic in the book. So it was a really challenging decision for me to just be like, okay, we're going to leave it here and we're going to instead explore 2020 and 2021 in the form of notes at the back of the book. But I think it was right for their story because, you know, we're sitting at 2021 right now and life still is constantly changing, and the realities of what it means to be an immigrant in Canada are still constantly changing as we speak. And I think that they're going to continue for quite a long time.
Okay. So you also like briefly mentioned the word fantasy earlier. Can you tell us what you're working on next?
Yeah, so currently I am working on a fantasy novel set in Abbotsford, which is where I grew up in BC. And just like if I tell you the truth, this is a novel that centers teenage Punjabi characters who grew up where I grew up. And exactly like I said, I write these novels and I'm so drawn to these stories because growing up, these are the kind of stories that I needed that I didn't necessarily get. Um, and to be able to bring these stories to life now is really, really exciting to me. And it's like, in a lot of ways, like the honor of my life to be able to give back to kids who love reading and who have constantly sought themselves the stories that they pick up in the school library, but have never had access to.
And do you think that this next book will also contain a both poetry and prose, or do you know yet?
I don't think so. I think that if I tell you the truth, it was a unique project for me in terms of like being very experimental in how I melded poetry and prose. And I think the power in prose, as opposed to poetry, is that you're really able to flesh out and clarify that which needs clarification. And that's why for a fantasy novel in which I'm doing so much world building about things that may be entirely new to my readers, prose feels like the right way to go. Because I will not be like condensing big ideas that need to be like sat in for a while and absorbed.
And is this book YA?
Yeah, this is why. Yeah.
Do you feel like that's your place as in YA, or do you ever want to? Because Kitten is a grown up in the end of it, right? So you've got a little bit of adult characters in there too. But do you feel like YA is your spot?
For now, at least in life, I think that YA is my happy place. I love reading YA. I think that there's something really honest and fun about it as a reader and as a writer. So I see myself here for a long time, and I think I wouldn't say no to the idea of adult fiction at some point in my life. But this is where I see myself for a while at least.
Okay. And did you know you talked about being a reader from a very young age? Did you always want to be a writer?
I don't think so. I think that I didn't know that being a writer was like a real avenue for myself, despite the fact that I enjoyed writing in university when I was in my earlier 20s. I didn't necessarily know where to go about, you know, publishing a book or, you know, moving forward with a manuscript concept. It seemed like something that other people do who are really lucky and who are, you know, in my mind at that time, like far more talented than me and far more deserving of a book deal. So I never seriously considered it, until my first poetry collection became like a project that I was so drawn to a few years before I ended up with my publishing deal. Like I knew I had a poetry collection in me. It's my first book. When you asked me where I'm going, was that book, and I was certain that I had the capacity to pull my poems together in a meaningful way that could one day be held in my hands in a book. But to see it come to life was that moment for me where I was like, this is this is where I need to be, and this is where I can be, and this is also where I deserve to be, because like I said, like I had that self-doubt within myself, which I think is internalized in so many young women, that we are not enough in whatever creative field we enter. But I'm glad that I was able to get there for myself.
So these were the first books you wrote?
Yep.
These two? And when you started writing them, especially, I guess poetry is a little bit different, but when you started writing this one, did you know right from the beginning that it was YA, or did you just know, I have a story, I have these characters, I'm not totally sure, just because there is, you know, someone who starts off as a teenager and then grows up in it, but then you also have the teenager. So did you know that was where it was going to sit, or did you just start with the characters?
So I first started, if I tell you the truth, in a YA, like a children's literature class in university. And as I started fully, fleshing out and drafting the story, that's when I was like, okay, there's a part of Gideon's life that doesn't fit neatly within the confines of like her teenage years. And that part of her story needs to be rendered as well. And it kind of like pushes the line a little bit into like, new adult. And that's where you see us switch into her teenage daughter's perspective. So it to me is at its core YA, and it's YA that pushes the boundaries in every possible way.
And it's become very common now with books. There's so many really popular adult books that, half of the book is someone back in their teenage years or something. So it feels like the years of, you only have a teenager, you only have an adult, that there's a lot of blending between that now. So it's good. For people who loved your book, can you recommend other books that they might like as well?
Yeah. So I don't have a list of too many books on hand, but I just want to show you some of the books on my bookshelf. So I just finished reading Juliet Takes a Breath, by Gabby Rivera, which is a beautiful book. And Gabby's work is like something that inspires so much of what I do. And if you are a fan of wholesome, beautiful, like lyrical storytelling, like this book is absolutely for you.
And that's out? Is that new?
Yeah.
Okay.
This I think came out about a year and a half ago.
Oh, okay. Awesome. So we only have, I think, about 2 minutes left. Is there anything else you would like to tell your readers about your book, or say that I didn't ask that you wish I asked?
I am so excited for readers to be able to pick up this book in so many different formats. Like I said, it's available in hardcover, but it's also available as an audiobook, which is narrated by me, and it's also available as an ebook. So whatever is accessible to you, go and find that one. And I hope that this read is a meaningful one to you, and I hope that it stays with you for a long time.
Awesome. And do we have any idea when we'll see another, when your next, are you just starting your next book? Is it
So we don't have
still coming soon yet?
a timeline yet, not yet. But hopefully I'll have that news within months, within a few months.
Awesome. I'm just going to check if there's any other questions in my tab. I don't see any other ones, and I think my clock is showing I have a minute left. So I'm supposed to say thank you, Jasmine, for joining us from Abbotsford, where it's probably not dark yet. I'm just looking at it, it's suddenly very dark here in Ottawa. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm really glad I got invited to do this, and I had the opportunity to read your book and listen to your book. I'm still amazed that you did an audiobook on your own. I think I only know one other author who took on that challenge. It's not something I would want to do. So thank you very much for coming to speak with us. I also like to thank everybody. I can't see you, so virtually, thank you to everybody who came the time to listen. This discussion is going to remain live on Facebook for a week. Obviously, if you're listening to me right now, you did get the chance to listen, but if you missed the beginning, or if you know someone who didn't get the chance to listen who would like to do so later, they have a week to go onto Facebook to watch the recording of it. So again, thanks again to everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope if you haven't read the book that you get your hands on it soon. Bye.